because this is part of my nervousness, and if I just put it on the table, then I think I'll be good. I'm not a Southeast Asian scholar, and I don't claim expertise in Southeast Asia. So for those of you in the audience that are experts on this region of the world, my apologies for the limitations of my knowledge about the specifics of the region, and then particularly the migration flows in this particular region. So the purpose of this talk is to talk more about the collateral damage report that GAATW Bangkok, Thailand put out, the principles behind the collateral damage report, and then use some examples from Southeast Asia to illustrate some of the points that have been made. So I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the Global Alliance Against Trafficking in Women Canada, and the reason why I say that is because there's the larger international alliance whose international secretariat is in Bangkok, Thailand. GAATW Canada was established in 1996, and basically since that time my focus has mainly been on labor migration issues and human trafficking in and to the Canadian context. So the work that we've done in GAATW Canada has involved crisis intervention. For example, I don't know if you recall, but there were a series of massage parlor raids in Toronto in 1997, Project Orphan, in 1998, Project Trade. And this work began long before trafficking became a household word. And these raids involved migrant sex workers from Thailand who GAATW researchers interviewed for a study that we did entitled Transnational Migration, Trafficking in Women and Human Rights, the Canadian Dimension, and that was completed in 2002. The other thing that GAATW Canada has been doing is that we do advocacy work, public awareness. We monitor and act as consultants on the development of federal and provincial government legislation, policies, and anti-trafficking strategies in Canada, and we also do research. So recently, very recently, about a week ago, we were contracted by the federal government, more specifically the Department of Public Safety and National Preparedness, and I think that's the Homeland Security in Canada. And we've been contracted to conduct research on the link between international sporting events, in this case the Olympics, 2010 Olympics, and human trafficking. And if you've been reading the press in the last 1.5 years or more, you will know that there has been considerable discussion about the predicted or assumed rise in human trafficking for the purposes of prostitution, in particular during the 2010 Olympics. So what our aim is, in keeping with collateral damage, is to take an evidence-based approach on this ongoing debate, which is also beginning to rage in South Africa around the 2010 FIFA World Cup, and is also beginning to surface in the UK leading up to the 2012 Summer Olympic Games. The timelines we have are incredibly short, so all of our findings and the final report will be ready in June. The federal government doesn't mess around with deadlines, not like SHRC, where you can get extensions. Okay, so having said that, the context of what GAATW Canada does, Canada is also a member organization of GAATW, as I mentioned, which was founded in 1994 and whose international secretariat is located in Bangkok, Thailand. The alliance is comprised of about 100 non-governmental organizations in most regions of the world, and member organizations include migrant rights, human rights, women's rights, and anti-trafficking organizations, as well as self-organized groups of migrant workers, domestic workers, sex workers, and survivors of trafficking. So for the sake of clarification, and I think that when I give these talks, I always need to give quite a lot of context, because what is this thing that we're talking about? Because trafficking is talked about so much and utilized in various ways, and so there has to be some precision about where GAATW Canada and GAATW International stands on these issues. So beginning in the 1990s, there were two main anti-trafficking organizations internationally. There's the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, CAPI as we call it, And the mission of CAATW is to combat all forms of sexual exploitation and understands prostitution and trafficking as integrally linked. So in other words, CAATW would argue that all women, and their focus is mainly on women, exclusively on women, who work in the sex industry are trafficking victims. So that's one discourse. GAATW, on the other hand, sees the phenomenon of human trafficking as intrinsically embedded in the context of migration for the purposes of labor. In other words, human trafficking is conceptualized within the broader context and continuum of labor migration constituting its most coercive and abusive form, with voluntary, irregular, undocumented, and forced movements occurring from regions of generally economic disadvantage to regions of greater economic advantage. That is, for example, if we want to talk about Asia, from rural to urban areas in Thailand, from Nepal to India, from Russia to Germany, although that's a European example, from Myanmar to Thailand, from Thailand, Malaysia to Canada, and the list goes on. So the circuits of our migration are many, but generally what scholars find is that people are moving predictably from areas of economic disadvantage to where they see economic advantage. In fact, according to statistics released by the UN Population Division in 2002, the global migrant population has more than doubled since 1975. It has reached, in 2002, it had reached 175 million people, of which about half are women. In 2005, there was a substantial increase to between 185 to 192 million people, or 3% of the world population is part of this migrant group. This number does not, however, include the approximately 15 to 30 million irregular migrants worldwide who are illegal, undocumented, smuggled, or trafficked. So in other words, people are moving and are being moved within countries, within regions, transnationally on an incredibly large scale. And this is where, according to GAATW's analysis, this is where human trafficking needs to be situated. And many studies do suggest, although statistics are very, very difficult when you're talking about human trafficking, and that would be a talk in and of itself, but many studies estimate that some of the highest rates of human trafficking occur within Asia, and particularly within Southeast Asia. So since the signing of the UN Trafficking Protocol, which I'll talk a little bit about, in 2000, and this was the latest international treaty designed to combat trafficking on a global scale, and its ratification by 155 countries, so there is a substantial ratification of the UN Trafficking Protocol. Globally, there has been a huge proliferation of anti-trafficking organizations, and more recently, anti-slavery organizations. And there seem to be two sort of competing organizational forces, the anti-slavery groups, anti-slavery organizations that are focusing on modern-day forms of slavery, and then anti-trafficking organizations that are more linked to an earlier discourse around combating particular forms of forced labor or exploitation. And some critics have argued, actually, that this proliferation of organizations has largely been donor-driven, with hundreds of millions of dollars invested in anti-trafficking work and campaigns, particularly in the Third World and the former Soviet bloc. The US, particularly the Bush administration, was one of the biggest investors, and we don't seeing that decline. For example, between 2001 and 2006, the US government invested $447 million on anti-trafficking initiatives involving 100 countries in 2005 alone. So I'll say a little bit more about the US role in a bit. So what is human trafficking? I mean, I think that one of the, and this is part of the context that needs to be established here, is that there's a lot of misconceptions or use of the term trafficking that isn't necessarily consistent with the international definition, and to some extent governments also utilize the anti-trafficking framework for their own purposes. Border control, restricting the mobility of people, particularly from the third world to the first world, and certainly within regions of the world they're also wanting to restrict mobility from Nepal to India, et cetera, et cetera. So these are really integrally linked, and sometimes the lines between an irregular or an illegal migrant who finds him or herself in a forced labor situation, the lines between that situation and a trafficking situation, or what is called a trafficking situation or a case of trafficking, oftentimes those lines are very, very blurred. But one of the things I think that is important is, particularly in the popular imaginary, that, and this has certainly been a driving force around a lot of anti-trafficking campaigns, that human trafficking and prostitution are often conflated. And it is certainly the case at the global level, whether we're talking about Southeast Asia or Europe or Canada or the United States, that targeting sex trafficking has been the principal focus of anti-trafficking laws, policies, campaigns, and interventions. And these can be interventions, government interventions, these can be NGO interventions. There is a new group called the International Justice Mission. It's a Christian-based, US-based organization that does raid and rescue operations in India, Cambodia, Thailand, etc. So there are a lot of interventions. And prostitution has been one of the main foci of most anti-trafficking interventions. And so it's been really, really relatively recently that there has been greater attention paid to the trafficking of men, women, and children into other labor sites, including domestic service, the construction sector, factory work, the agricultural and fishing sectors, as well as begging, circus performances, camel jockeying, etc., etc. So, just a little by way of definition, that the UN Trafficking Protocol provided the very first international definition of trafficking. It took 1 year for government delegates and NGOs to agree on a very convoluted definition of what it was precisely that anti-trafficking measures were attempting to address, eradicate, combat, etc. And the main debate here was what I mentioned previously, and this is the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women's position, is the main debate here over the 1 year was whether all adult prostitution, whether voluntary or forced, should be defined as trafficking. So that was what was being battled over. The Vatican versus Germany, right? Fighting over whether all forms of sexual services should be considered trafficking. So finally, after a year, they came up with a compromise definition, and basically, trafficking in persons involves 3 distinct elements. 1, a set of actions that involved recruiting or moving someone. Recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, and receipt of a person. So there's a set of actions that involve recruiting and movement. Second, the means by which those actions are carried out. The threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, the abuse of power. So there's the recruitment and the movement. There are the means by which those actions are carried out. And then thirdly, there's the purpose. And the purpose is forms of exploitation for which people are being recruited or moved. Sexual exploitation being one, forced labor being another. Slavery or practices similar to slavery are another. Servitude, the removal of organs, is also included in the trafficking definition. The other significant part of this definition is because this battle over whether prostitution is violence against women or women's labor, and men are also involved in prostitution as are transgender people, et cetera, the interesting thing is that there's no international definition of sexual exploitation. So countries were left to define and address sexual exploitation as they deemed appropriate in accordance with their own prostitution laws. Some countries like Germany and Netherlands, prostitution is legal. In Canada, prostitution is illegal, but everything that's surrounding it is. And so there are varying laws, and so because there was no agreement on what, how to conceptualize prostitution and different according to country, sexual exploitation was never defined. So that's the first thing. So these are the three elements. And if you're 18 years old or older, all three elements need to be involved for the case to be considered trafficking. If you're 18 years or under, then the second part, the threats, the use of force, etc., does not have to be an element. It's simply movement and forced labor, right? So the threats, the abduction, etc., doesn't have to be an element for adolescents and children. It's very hard to implement this in the judicial system. All right, a little bit more about, I'm just going quickly. I will move more quickly. Another few things about the trafficking protocol, because it really sets the framework for anti-trafficking interventions and the way in which they have been taken up by state governments. And this includes Southeast Asia and other regions of the world. The trafficking protocol sits or supplements the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. So that should give you an indication of what the main priority is in terms of the trafficking protocol. So even though the trafficking protocol talks about preventing trafficking, protecting and assisting trafficked persons with the full respect of their human rights, and prosecuting traffickers, the treaty is primarily a law enforcement tool designed to combat organized crime and to control national borders. It has very strong law enforcement measures, such as criminalization and border measures, and these are defined as mandatory state obligations for nations that ratify the treaty. And this really reflected the concerns of destination and transit countries, especially the global north, that all of these provisions are designed to enhance the ability to detect and prosecute traffickers. And a recent report commissioned by the United Nations Office on Drug and Crimes as part of the UN Global Initiative to Fight Human Trafficking, very large report, indicates that 79% of the 155 countries who have ratified the treaty have passed laws against trafficking in persons. 54% have established special anti-trafficking police unit, and more than half have developed a national action plan to deal with the issue. There have also been the establishment of regional memorandums of understanding, for example in South Asia, and also amongst Southeast Asian countries. There's a memorandum of understanding between Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, for example, that establish guidelines and strategies for regional cooperation and anti-trafficking efforts. So the laws are all in place. 155 countries have signed on. They all have lots of laws. They have police units, etc., etc. But unlike these law enforcement provisions, And as I said, the response in this regard has been widespread in terms of passing legislation. And there's another key player that I'll talk about in a moment. The articles pertaining to the assistance of and services for those classified as trafficking use discretionary language, and these apply mainly to persons who are willing to act as witnesses in criminal prosecutions against traffickers. So, if you're discovered as a trafficked person, Bangkok, Toronto, your access to assistance is contingent on whether you're going to cooperate with legal authorities to prosecute traffickers. And as you can well imagine, there may be some risks involved with that. There aren't necessarily very elaborate witness protection programs for trafficked persons. And oftentimes, cooperation does not mean safety, because cooperation does not come with right to asylum. And generally, the main strategy of destination countries is to detain for protective measures, and that's one of the things that GAATW is fighting very much against, is that protective detention is a violation of a person's rights. And there have been case after case of trafficked persons or people suspected of being trafficked who were detained by social welfare authorities in Bangkok or by NGOs who say, how is this different from being under the control of a trafficker? I'm still being confined, although this is in the name of protection. So there need to be other sorts of strategies. So detention, first of all, repatriation, second of all. And again, you can well imagine that repatriation also may not be a very safe option for someone, especially if you still owe debts to your broker or to your trafficker. And so, or you're worried that the safety of your family may be at risk. So there's all of these reasons why these measures of having assistance conditional on your cooperation, and the strategy of even if you cooperate, you're going to go back anyway. And why would I risk being a witness in a prosecution case, and then be sent back anyway? It's not in the best interests of a trafficked person to use that strategy. They get nothing, right? Except more risk, except more confinement. So these are some of the areas that we've looked at. But so in the trafficking protocol, the assistance and protection provisions are discretionary. And government delegates were virtually unanimous in their opposition to the adoption of mandatory language in this area: emergency shelter, medical services, right to asylum, because they wanted to exercise this right to repatriate people as quickly as possible. So as I said, in most countries of the world, Thailand is no exception, Canada is no exception. Protective detention and repatriation are the most common strategies used in anti-trafficking situations or cases of trafficking. And as I said, GAATW research did do a study on returnees, women that had been deported from Canada, the women that we interviewed. Many of them got deported while we were conducting the research. And they suggested that in most cases, women who have returned either via deportation or voluntarily, but there's always a lot of pressure to leave voluntarily, is that these socioeconomic or familial conditions that initially precipitated, for example, a woman to leave and engage in cross-border movements will not necessarily have changed upon her return, and she may face repercussions if she still owes a debt. And in many cases then, women are propelled or forced to re-enter the system. So they may be in Toronto, and in fact, the women that we interviewed in Toronto went back to Thailand, and they were in Vancouver 6 months later. So as a measure to counteract forced labor, et cetera, this particular strategy doesn't seem to be working. In other sort of specifics around Thailand is one of the reasons that Jackie Pollock in the Collateral Damage report, she talks about migration from Thailand and argues that there is a lot of government-sponsored migration. There are also a lot of warnings to women about the potential risks that they face. But government-sponsored migration programs are costly, they're complicated, and if you're in a rural area in Thailand, would mean many trips to Bangkok to get it all organized, passports and papers and all of those kinds of things. And so potential migrants often are inclined to use brokers to facilitate the migration process. And whether the brokers are legitimate or not is an open question, and that is certainly one of the risks. Thailand is also a destination country for migrants from Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, who work in various industries. And in 2004, 1.28 million migrants were registered in Thailand. But there is also a large-scale reliance on brokers in the regions to navigate the various checkpoints. And these services can be very costly, debts are incurred, and with debt becomes increasing vulnerability. And in Thailand, by the way, repatriation is also the favored strategy for trafficked persons or illegal migrants. So in this sense, the protocol is not a human rights instrument at all. The lives, needs, and interests of those who fall under the definition of trafficked persons are positioned as secondary unless they're given a little bit of a breathing room, a reflection time, if they assist in the criminal prosecution against traffickers. So, another key player in all of this is the U.S. State Department. And I need to talk about that because this is very significant, again, in the way in which anti-trafficking measures, campaigns, interventions, legislation on a global scale have unfolded since the signing of the Trafficking Protocol in 2000. So, in 2000, after the signatures, the ratification process happened in 2003, the protocol was ratified. The U.S. State Department declared itself the global watchdog of anti-trafficking efforts. So if you go to the U.S. State Department site, you can find all the trafficking persons reports since 2001. And so every year in June, we wait, and the U.S. State Department releases its very controversial trafficking in persons reports, in which the performance of most nations of the world in meeting the U.S.'s minimum standards for combating and eliminating trafficking is evaluated. The main criteria for ranking nations is the number of trafficking prosecutions. So that's the main criteria. They do talk about prevention, they do talk about protection, but the main thing that the U.S. State Department report cards, they want to see prosecutions. So you can see where the pressure points might be. Countries were originally ranked in 3 tiers, and in 2004, a 4th tier was added, the Tier 2 watch list. So Tier 1, you're doing fine. Tier 2, not so good. Tier 2 watch list, really marginal. Tier 3, you're absolutely hopeless, is basically how it works. And there are also pressures attached to nations to comply with the US imposed minimum standards. Those countries ranked in Tier 3, and predictably countries like Cuba, North Korea, and Syria are here, and so there's a lot of discussion about how subjective and politically motivated these rankings are. Those countries that are ranked in Tier 3 may be subject to certain sanctions by the US, in that the US government may hold non-humanitarian, non-trade related foreign assistance, and governments subject to sanctions also could face US opposition to assistance from international financial institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. So there is a lot of pressure, and if you think that this is just paper, I can't say. But I do know that there is considerable pressure on governments to keep their rankings. And I'll talk about Cambodia towards the end of my talk. The other area that is very significant here is also beginning in 2003, the US Bush administration announced that it would no longer fund through USAID, which is one of the largest funders of anti-trafficking initiatives, especially in the Third World and the former Eastern Bloc. They wouldn't fund any organizations that did not explicitly condemn prostitution. So this had a chilling effect on organizations working with sex workers, particularly in promoting their human rights, and also who are doing a great deal of HIV/AIDS work with sex workers. So in 2003, there was a cable signed by Colin Powell and circulated to USAID field officers that stipulated that organizations needed to amend their websites to promote abstinence rather than condom use in the struggle against HIV and AIDS. Another stipulation was that USAID and other funding should not support sex work projects, as I mentioned, needle exchange, and abortion services. In 2005, this was formalized through a measure entitled Prohibition on the Promotion or Advocacy of Legalization or Practice of Prostitution or Sex Trafficking. So this is the context in which the world operates. So this gets me to collateral damage, and one of my examples, which is Cambodia. So in 2007, GAATW released the report, Collateral Damage, the Impact of Anti-Trafficking Measures on Human Rights Around the World. And basically, this is a critical assessment of anti-trafficking measures in 8 countries, including Thailand being one of them. Each concluded that despite the investment, and I quote here, many hundreds of millions of dollars, with the biggest investor being the US, in an effort to eradicate trafficking persons globally, and despite the good intentions of countless non-governmental organizations working on this issue in most regions of the world, there is now substantial evidence to suggest that anti-trafficking initiatives have had, and I quote again, unacceptably negative consequences for marginalized categories of people, such as migrants, and that these measures have been counterproductive for some of the very people they are to benefit most directly, such as sex workers and migrant sex workers, who have been the main focus of anti-trafficking interventions. And in terms of unacceptable consequences for migrants, I think the key argument here is that because there has been so much of focus on trafficking in women, and especially trafficking in women for the purposes of prostitution, that this has eclipsed what is often considered to be the more mundane and economically justifiable state-sponsored exploitation of migrant workers. Or as Mike Doddridge argued in Collateral Damage, the narrow focus on trafficking seems in many countries to act as a justification for not taking action to end all of the abuse to which migrant workers in the informal sectors of the economy are subjected. And this is also evident in comparing the number of nations, 155, who ratified the UN Trafficking Protocol, and the mere 26 who have ratified the UN Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and members of their families. The only signatories of the Migrant Worker Convention are migrant sending countries who are worried about their people, but not a single Western migrant receiving nation in North America, Europe, Australia, etc., have even signed the protocol or signed the convention. So the conclusion of the report then is that the priority for governments around the world in efforts to stop human trafficking has been to arrest, prosecute, and punish traffickers rather than to promote the human rights of people who have been trafficked or the human rights of migrant workers more generally. And many of the prevention strategies that have been implemented, particularly in the Third World and the post-Soviet bloc, is restricting the mobility, particularly of women. And these are strategies to curb or prevent women's cross-border movements in the name of protecting them from potential abuse and exploitation. And basically what they're saying here is that women should stay home and not move. Regardless of their economic or familial circumstances, you'll be safe if you stay home and not try and move. And these strategies are really based on the assumption that A, women are incapable of decision making and are in need of protection by male guardians, the state, and that reducing or stopping the flow, particularly of female labor migration, without considering the root causes of cross-border movements, will solve the problem of trafficking in women. It doesn't take into account that controlling or hindering women's right to migrate, or in the case of destination countries for securing borders in the name of protecting them from harm, does not prevent or curb reliance on third parties and illicit channels to facilitate migration. Women are taking risks, men are taking risks. They are going to rely on third parties to facilitate their migration if they need to move. But when you try and have strategies that curb migration, it moves much of this more underground, and it really intensifies the potential violations and abuses to which mobile people are subjected, and it also increases the profits that can be derived from facilitating cross-border movements and exploitative labor practices. In the case of the Thai women we interviewed, the women who were moved into Canada, if there were difficulties that the agents faced in moving them across the borders, their debt increased by $2,000. So the harder it is, the more profitable it is as well. So these are the main conclusions and of collateral damage. And one of the things that GAATW is attempting to do is they're lobbying for a review of the UN trafficking protocol. And what they are looking to do, or we are looking to do, is to engage in a process which would involve independent, mainly non-governmental assessments of all signatory nations' anti-trafficking responses in order to evaluate whether or not the protocol has fulfilled its intended purpose. This would be a counter-assessment to the TIP reports, and it would really introduce a much-needed alternative of accountability with due attention paid to the harmful and counterproductive impacts of contemporary anti-trafficking strategies and the human costs involved. So in the next 2 minutes, I'll talk about Cambodia, because I think this has been the biggest case in the last 2 years about how things can go awry. Is anybody familiar with the Cambodia anti-trafficking? Cambodia has received a lot of international attention. particularly around child prostitution, but prostitution more generally. Daryl Hannah did a raid and rescue operation with an undercover camera, which is on the internet. The Christian-based organization International Justice Mission had Dateline at hand to do a rescue and raid operation in Cambodia. So, Cambodia was under intense pressure from the US State Department, Tier 3. Really, really bad ranking. So the Cambodian government passed a new anti-trafficking law in 2008, the law on the suppression of human trafficking and sexual exploitation. Basically what the law did, there were 52 provisions. It outlawed prostitution and criminalized trafficking. So if you're interested in this, there are a number of YouTube videos online which provide first-person narratives from sex workers which talk about the consequences of the implementation of the new law. Widespread arrests of brothel-based and freelance sex workers, their incarceration in detention centers under deplorable conditions, 1 bag of rice, you pee in a plastic bag, police brutality, widespread beatings and rapes. Money was stolen from the women, and really of concern to NGOs working in the area was the really significant decline of the use of condoms. And the rationale here was that sex workers who continued to work on the streets felt that police, if they were carrying condoms, that police would think that they were prostitutes, and back they go into the detention center for more rapes and beatings. So there was, and a lot of the sex workers in Cambodia, well, I don't know what the percentage is, but the significant proportion are HIV positive. And so there is this real fear of the collapse, the whole collapse of all the work that NGOs have done around public health and around HIV prevention, et cetera, et cetera. And there were extensive protests by sex workers, which you can see online, against USAID, against the US government for the type of pressure they put on to the Cambodian government, and of course against the police because of their brutality, and of course the government for passing this legislation. So this is an example of what we call in GAATW collateral damage. And I'll end with that because we're running out of time, but I think that one of the things that we're attempting to do is both open up the trafficking protocol to review and how anti-trafficking measures have been operationalized in countries of destination and also in sending countries, and also to really open up the discussion about the links between migration and trafficking and how the lines between the two are very blurred, and simultaneously really look closely at what a human rights-centered approach looks like, where this kind of collateral damage isn't an ongoing consequence of anti-trafficking campaigns and measures. Sorry about going over time, but I'm happy to take questions.
Annalee, thank you very much indeed for a very thoughtful and very inspiring